Hello, as I said in part one, there was very little need for the army in the British development because of British culture being especially aggressive in terms of the amount of football violence and boxing and other things and MMA in our culture. It was very orientated around that kind of fighting. For the army to actually teach sort of hand-to-hand fighting as in comparison to the American army, which spend quite a tremendous amount of their time on that and on building up the physical upper body of their troops. Much more important for the British Army is a concentration on marksmanship over rate of fire and fieldcraft, and very long, arduous and fast marches. A common criticism made by British soldiers of American soldiers is, yes, you're strong in the gym, but you cannot run. And in the British Army, they will run your legs until your feet are like bits of meat, basically. They want to get to you to under 7-minute miles, and to be able to do that for 10 to 30 miles. In World War II, the British Army were capable, even in Burma, where my grandfather was, of marching up to 60 miles a day. That's in tropical heat, with little water and little food, with very heavy packs, even with mules helping. Now, beyond this, any army could train themselves up to that, and the Americans could change their doctrine, which is based on the Prussian doctrine. And so the Prussian doctrine is about taking people who have some military knowledge because of the culture of being a gun culture, and a farming culture, and thus getting them ready for actual military aggressive movements. Okay, with Britain, there's less familiarity with firearms, and we're perhaps less willing to kill, whereas we're more willing to actually get into a fist fight. That's the general idea. But beyond this, what is our military doctrine? Well, the British soldier is trained in many different ways, from peacekeeping to being a builder as well as a killer. After killing in the battle, and because it's linked to it being a job, it's much more easy, although there have been war crimes committed, particularly in the Boer War and in World War I and World War II by British soldiers, but it's more quickly able to divorce emotion from the actual action. So once they won't stop killing until they've been told to stop killing. Or when they've been told to stop killing, they will stop killing. It's the end of the job. There's a new task. Okay? So war for us is not personal. The Americans, when one of their people are killed, in Vietnam particularly, there was a need for instant and overwhelming revenge. Okay? So therefore, until the post-World War II era, the American soldier and the German soldier's doctrine was quite similar. You can see an emphasis of firepower over accuracy in terms of the American and the German army, and that's why perhaps you take the Waffen-SS and later the Israeli army, who were trained by the British Army. Even though the Haganah also was the inspiration for the Israeli army, who were actually killing British soldiers at the time. The King David Hotel bombing, for instance, who Ariel Sharon was part of. Both the Waffen-SS and later the Israeli army looked at British Army doctrine. Yes, it was aggressive. Yes, it wanted to close with the enemy, and the British were fond of the bayonet, but they were more fond of using the distance and the accuracy of their rifles. But more beyond this, what was the actual doctrine of the British Army and what is it now? Well, they believe firmly in mission control, and this is something that the Germans in World War II particularly used. This was the idea that any German soldier could do the job of any German officer, and so in the British Army, any Tom can do the job of the officer. If the officer is shot, the Tom knows that person's job is immediately above him. Therefore, there's no need for centralised control, as there was in World War One, in the earlier part of World War One. Later on, the kind of pure regimental structures later have more and more become combined arms. So that part of the old British doctrine has fallen away. Now, in the post-war period, particularly in Malaya, they used what I call the Fabian incremental strategy, which I mentioned in my vid, Stoic War versus Terrorism. And that was to break the same strategy that General Fabian used against Carthage, and that was an economic strategy backed up with a very aggressive military strategy, but that was a minimum of force directed at certain people and certain groups. And this was a scorched earth policy in terms of breaking economic links between the civilian population and terrorist networks. Now, in Malaya, there was up to 3 insurgencies happening: a nationalist insurgency, an Islamic insurgency, and a Maoist insurgency, and the British overcame all 3 at the same time. In Iraq, arguably the same situation was happening, with a Saudi Al-Qaeda backed insurgency, with another Ba'athist nationalist secular insurgency and an Iranian insurgency. So the British were in the same situation in both areas. Also, there is similar cases in Afghanistan, where the Taliban and Bin Laden operatives and Al-Qaeda are all working together, and with the Saudi operatives and the Pakistani ISI, so it's not easy to know who your friends are. This breaking of economic ties created a no man's land of non-connections, and so therefore the terrorist group would wither from it within and contract from without, because a man might escape a bullet or a bayonet, but he cannot escape lack of shelter, lack of thirst, hunger, and lack of political and economic protection. Okay, you take in the case of the tragic loss of 3 German soldiers recently near Kunduz, and 5 of them were wounded. It just showed how much firepower the 8-man section of Germans had against the Taliban in that area, who were up to 200 men. But they couldn't move that force around unless they had satellite backing from people like Al-Qaeda and the Bin Laden family above them, and political protection from the locals. Without a political protection, they cannot move. They lack mobility, unless they would be destroyed. Now, the use of forces is very interesting, because the British in Northern Ireland used a surge strategy, just like the Americans in Baghdad, and they both had similar outcomes, in that there was a disassociation between the military campaign and the civilians, and we got a bit of a pasting in both accounts. But when you use the Fabian incremental strategy, you also use winning hearts and minds, and so you bring over the people to. So later Petraeus looked at British doctrine and adopted it. Thank you.